All right. Hello, welcome to the beginning of Chapter 8, Photosynthesis. So we're going to break this up into several different sections here. Our first section will discuss some of the preliminary information about photosynthesis, and then we'll move on to the actual details. This video I'll record like this, showing the slides, but I think the next videos will probably be better if I'll just record directly onto the board so I can walk you through it step by step easier. Okay, so first off, everyone knows what photosynthesis is, but let's just clarify some of our terminology and some of the details that go into it. So first off, what's the difference between different types of organisms? Specifically, like, how are plants and animals really different? We talked about how one of the characteristics of living things at the beginning of the year, that all living things need to have energy to survive, to keep themselves alive, to keep their cells running. Autotrophs and heterotrophs are just ways of describing how living things get that energy. An autotroph, that word troph or trophic means energy. Auto, you guys know what that means. It means they can do it themselves. So an autotroph is like autopilot. It flies itself. Autotroph is it does its energy itself. So that means they can produce their own molecules, their own food for their energy. For example, we all know that plants make things like sugars. Sugars are carbohydrates. We talked about how carbohydrates were very good to store energy in, and if you break those down, you get energy from them. Right? So they can, carbohydrates can last a long time. That's why you want to make them. So autotrophs can produce their own molecules so that they can break down when they're ready to get energy from it. Heterotrophs don't work like that. The prefix hetero simply means different, and so that means different energy. So we have to go out, because we're heterotrophic, and find our own food and eat it and break it down and get those molecules that we can then use for energy. So what kind of organisms are autotrophs? Obviously plants. What kind of organisms are heterotrophs? Obviously animals. Fungus are also heterotrophic. So when you see a mushroom growing out of the side of a tree, it's really eating that tree for its dinner. The main difference is that as a heterotroph, fungus digests its food externally, whereas we digest our food inside of our body or internally. If an organism is a photoautotroph, that means it uses light to do the autotroph thing, i.e. plants, algae would be an example of a photoautotroph as well. There's a few, but not very many, chemoautotrophs, that is organisms, namely bacteria, that can break down like inorganic materials, even like rocks, and get a small amount of energy from that. They can use it to generate a carbohydrate. So those are very few and far between, so we aren't going to worry about those right now. We want to focus on photoautotrophs, about using light as the energy source to be able to build that carbohydrate molecule. We've already mentioned, I think, this term, but there's a compound called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. This is your body's energy currency. You, as an organism, want to generate ATP because that's what living things use to transfer energy from place to place within a cell. ATP only lasts a couple minutes, so you have to constantly be generating this. Or if you do generate it, you have to then convert it to some other molecule or transfer the energy to another molecule to store it for a long period of time. These are really short-lived, but they're made in your mitochondria, which we talked about many times. And those mitochondria generate constantly ATP to keep yourself alive. So real briefly, how does that work? Right? ATP, if you look down here, is adenosine triphosphate. Okay, a phosphate is a PO4 functional group. So whenever you have triphosphate, you have 3 Ps, or phosphates, bonded onto this molecule. When you break that off, it makes energy available to do something with. So how are we going to recharge it? We have to have a way to hook that back on. One way is just to eat some food. Another way is to using some sunlight to actually generate some of this. We make a little bit of ATP in photosynthesis. In cellular respiration, we make ATP by breaking down a big sugar molecule. So how is this whole thing really different? These are, if you look at these two processes, photosynthesis and cellular respiration, and you look at the chemical formula, you can see that in photosynthesis, some carbon dioxide and some water will end up generating this carbohydrate, which is glucose, C6H12O6, which is really important, and some oxygen. And we all know that. If you look at cellular respiration, it's almost the opposite here. If you take some glucose and oxygen, you end up with some carbon dioxide and some water. Now, the difference is that in order to unite those different carbons and some of those hydrogens together, you need some light. Specifically, you need energy from light. That allows the plant to rearrange these two really common low energy molecules into this really nice high energy carbohydrate. Now, the cool thing about this is carbohydrates can be stored for a long period of time. If you set out a container of sugar on a shelf somewhere and walked away and came back in a year, as long as nothing had gotten into it, you could still eat it. It'd be perfectly fine. So the same thing for like plants. If they make a sugar like this glucose, or they link that glucose together and make starches like in a potato, that can store that until that plant is ready to grow again. So that's really useful for those organisms. If they need to get the energy back out from it, though, they are going to have to go through cellular respiration, where you break down that C6 into 6 different single carbon dioxide molecules, and they get energy back out of it. But they don't get energy back out of it as light. You get energy back out as ATP. And so cellular respiration is occurring here in the mitochondria, whereas photosynthesis is in the chloroplasts of plants. So the two reactions, the details of the reactions are rather different, but the overall formula are almost the inverse of one another. In photosynthesis, we make sugars. In cellular respiration, we break the sugars down to get energy back out of them. So the question is, do plants do photosynthesis? Yes. Do animals do photosynthesis? No. Okay, what about cellular respiration? Do animals do cellular respiration? Certainly, we have to eat to get food. Do plants do cellular respiration? Well, the answer is yes. Well, why? Because if they store some sugars, they have to have a mechanism to break it back down and get the energy back out. Like when it gets dark at night. If a plant couldn't have stored sugars that they could break apart and get energy back out of, they would die overnight, which wouldn't work very good. As long as the light's shining, they'd be okay. But because we want to store that energy and release it as needed, we have to be able to do cellular respiration. And the whole thing we want to generate is a sugar. Glucose is the primary sugar. Remember that glucose is a monomer, so you can build lots of other sugars out of this one. In fact, there's a precursor sugar called PGAL that has 6, instead of 6 carbons, has 3. And you can build all sorts of different crazy carbohydrates from it, right? They're monomers that can link together and form whole polymers, and they can form sheets and all sorts of different stuff. We can make cellulose from this. We can make starch from this. Lots of things can be generated from this basic molecule. And so this is what you want. Okay, you can see that all of these atoms are all held together in this big molecule. Each one of those chemical bonds, especially the carbon-carbon bond and the carbon-hydrogen bond, those are all storing a lot of energy in those chemical bonds. And the energy to generate those bonds came from sunlight. So how do you get that sunlight? Well, all of us have probably sat out in the sun before and like feel it. It's like, wow, that's burning my face, or it's hot, or it's warm. It feels good maybe. So there is energy and light. But how do you go from like this energy and light that's kind of like just heat to actually something that's more useful? To do that, you need to have a special molecule called a pigment. Pigments are a type of protein, and they are able to actually capture energy from light. They absorb the light energy. They don't just get hot. They are able to do something with it, right? So in plants specifically, the photosynthetic pigments are called chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. There's different types of chlorophyll. You can probably guess what color they are. You're right. They're green, right? So they are green pigments. And there is a chlorophyll C There are other pigments which are different colors, like the xanthophylls and carotenoids and all these other kinds. Plants have varying amounts of those others types of pigments, but their primary photosynthetic pigments are chlorophyll A and B. All plants have both of those. Algae, which are not plants, like a protist, like seaweed or something like that, some of them have chlorophyll, some don't. Okay, so what's so cool about these pigments? All right, well, as you can see on this wavelength chart, you can see you have a peak here around 440-ish, 430, 440, and you have a peak here in the 660s, 670s, right? Those are peak absorbance for chlorophyll A and B. And those happen to be wavelengths that are higher energy wavelengths. What they do not absorb are this blue, green, yellow, orange spectrum. What happens if you reflect, if you're not, absorbing something, you're reflecting it. So plants to us generally appear somewhere in the spectrum, which blue and yellow make green. So if all these wavelengths are reflected, we see plants as green, but the plants are absorbing these higher energy wavelengths of light here and here. Below this would be infrared, and above this would be ultraviolet, right? UV light. So the cool thing about these pigments is that not only do they absorb these wavelengths of light, they're able to take that energy from it and transfer it to something. Specifically, they transfer it to an electron. Now, this is really important because we're going from something which has no mass, which is just a wave type thing, a photon of light, and all of a sudden you give the energy that light had to an electron. Now, electrons have mass. We talked about so much that electrons determine how things react chemically. Electrons all of a sudden are matter. They're involved in chemical bonds, right? Like covalent bonds where electrons being shared, ionic bonds where electrons being transferred. So when you start energizing electrons, all of a sudden you go towards, hey, we've got chemical energy we can work with, because chemical energy involves electrons, all right? And then moving those electrons around. So that's the big deal about a pigment, is that they can grab the light and give it to electrons. All of a sudden, electrons are useful in joining things together. That's important. All right, so where does that happen? It happens inside of a chloroplast. We've talked about this the prior chapter. All right, so a little bit of anatomy of a chloroplast. It has a double membrane around it. Membranes, they're useful to contain materials. And inside of it, they have these stacks of little membrane sacs called thylakoids. And those thylakoids are a lipid bilayer, right? The whole lipid bilayer with the lipids and everything else. There's a bunch of pigments embedded inside of that membrane. Remember we talked about like integral proteins, or proteins that are built into that lipid bilayer. They're stuck into it. Well, in this case, a bunch of these proteins are embedded in those membranes. That's why there's so many of them. Each one of those little membrane sacs, or thylakoids, has a bunch of chlorophyll embedded in the sac, in the walls of that container, if you will. And there's these big stacks of them. So it's like a bunch of almost like solar panels all piled up on one another. And so that way they can all be absorbing light energy and starting to do something with that. Those pigments are arranged in what we call photosystems, or systems of light. And those photosystems go through a series of absorbing light and moving electrons around, right? Because we just want to charge up our electrons so we can actually do something with it. Once you charge up an electron, you've got to do something with it. So think of an electron for a living thing, a free electron that's all hopped up with energy, as kind of like a hot potato. You can't just let a free electron sit around. You have to have something receive that electron. You have to put on the oven mitts and grab the hot potato. Otherwise, you can't do anything with that, right? And so those pigments charge those electrons using light, but those electrons must be received by some sort of electron accepting molecule and hold on to it. That particular molecule is called NADP, okay? Or it's got a long name like nicosamide, adenine, dinucleotide, phosphate. which is why we're just going to call it NADP. NADP uses a hydrogen to act as that oven mitt, if you will, to hold on to or bond that high energy, that super jacked up electron that got hit by all that light energy, and it uses that hydrogen to hold on to it. Okay, so this is a temporary, short-term chemical battery, kind of like ATP. You know, ATP holds some energy. NADP, when it turns into NADPH, is holding an energetic electron, which it can then use, or the plant can use later on to help build that glucose molecule, because it's going to require energy and electrons to do that. Okay, we're going to stop there, and we'll actually take a look at those step by step through those different photosystems in the next video.